Good afternoon. I'm the moderator of Parallel Session 1. I am Yang Moon-soo, Vice President for Academic Affairs from the University of North Korean Studies. The theme of this session is 2021 Prospects for North Korean Economy and Inter-Korean Relations. As you understand, there's a very strong sanctions regime, as well as the flood. On top of that, you had the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's a triple dilemma for North Korea as well. A lot of people are now talking about a possible crisis over the North Korean economy, but there are some people saying that North Korean economy is resilient enough to overcome those crises. So it would be very important for us to look at the current status of the North Korean economy and the outlook for the economy going forward. So we have invited 7 renowned experts on this field. I'm going to introduce to you each and every one of the speakers first, and then go over the proceedings. To my far right, we have Dr. Lee Young-hoon from SK Research Institute, Research Fellow, and from Dongguk University, Dr. Kim Il-han is here. And from Sejong Institute, we have Dr. Choi Eun-ju. And from Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade, Dr. Kim Soo-jung. And from the Korean Institute of Science and Technology Information, Dr. Byun Hang-moo. And Dr. Choi Jang-ho from the KIEP. Last but not least, from the Korean Institute for National Unification, we have Dr. Choi Ji-young. We don't have any designated panelists, but we're given about 2 hours for this parallel session. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of issues that we need to take a look at, especially in terms of the interpretation of the current status of the North Korean economy. So I'm going to raise a few questions, and we will try to have a very active, interactive discussions amongst the speakers over here. So 10 minutes will be given to each of the speaker for their presentation. And then I have a list of questions that I will pose to our panelists over here, or maybe we could just deal with some of the common themes and take that up for discussion. And we'll also try to engage with the audience as well. So the first speaker I would like to introduce to you is from the SK Research Institute, Dr. Lee Young-hoon. Please, the floor is yours.
네, 안녕하세요.
Good afternoon. My name is Lee Hyung-hoon. I'm a research fellow at SK Research Institute. Today I want to talk about the changes in the economic institutions under Kim Jong-un in the DPRK. And I decided to look at this research topic because the sanctions placed by the international community have been very substantial. But despite that, we've seen a sort of a stabilization of the DPRK society. And I believe that is because there is decreased demand, or there could be increased supply, or there could be price controls at play. So these are some of the different theses that we can come up with. And to try to support the hypotheses, we have to look at the different kinds of changes in the economic institutions of the DPRK that have occurred in the past to try to come up with answers to this. And the key question that I would like to ask here are threefold. What are the major changes in the economic institutions of the DPRK under Kim Jong-un, and what are the specific characteristics there, and what are the expected outcomes? And lastly, what are the implications that these different changes in the economic institutions have to the DPRK sanctions? And I wanted to look at this a little bit more in depth, which is why I looked at the macroeconomic circulation model. This macroeconomic circulation model looks at the activities of the economic actors, wage, price, profit, difference of these variables, and 4 different markets, the different structural changes of 4 different kinds of markets. So that is why I chose this particular model to look at the situation in the DPRK. So I wanted to look at, first of all, the changes in the activities of the economic actors. There could be the government and companies. Oh, the government's changes would occur with the changes in the cabinet, in the regime. In the past, the economic policies would be implemented by different actors, but now this has been integrated into the cabinet. This means that in the past, the military and different actors in the party would be responsible for different aspects of the economic policies, but these have all been integrated at the level of the cabinet. And then there are changes at the corporate level, at the company level. So there are a lot of these different rights that are given to the corporations, such as their sales, rights of sales, right to form a production organization, right to manage their funding and finances, right to manage the quality, and right to manage HR, and etc. For this, I tried to look at Michael Porter's value chain model. And as a result, I was able to see that other than AS or after service, in all of the areas of corporate activity, there were very massive institutional changes for the companies or the organizations in the DPRK. Many of the support activities and the fundamental activities of the corporations, there were more autonomy given to these companies. Of course, the rights are given within the framework of the authorization of the state. So they can only do whatever the state has sanctioned. However, even within those confines, these companies have more autonomy compared to before. So if I were to give an example to this, through these institutional changes, there were 70% more of a right to the local autonomous governments and the companies to make their own decisions. This means that only about less than 1% of the plans are fully controlled by the central government, by the federal level. Oh, I'm going to skip over these very specific detail portions of my presentation in the interest of time, but I do want to talk about the overview of these very key characteristics of the changes in the economic institutions. And so their overall direction is to try to head towards a stronger socialist economy. So they want to try to maintain strict controls in the demand, but the resources be allocated according to market forces. This is being done in three different directions. Firstly, there is more autonomy given to companies and to different economic agents so that they can have more of a productivity, more of an increased productivity. But this is very much to look at a very simplified comparison between this institution and the institutions in the past. In the past, the economic actors were mostly the public sector or the government. But within these new changed framework, the major economic actors are private sector players, so many corporations. So in the past, it was the government who made all the plans and all the decisions, and they would issue orders to the corporations. And everything else, the government, all the distribution was done by the government, but a little bit has changed in that the corporations can have more autonomy to make decisions and plans. And after they have provided some level of a quota contribution to the state, the rest of their proceeds, the rest of their production output, they can do whatever they will with it. So they can exercise their own sale rights, and most of their production outputs are sold at market prices. And another thing is that the government is offering some more convenient services in industry, in retail and distribution, and this has led to a stronger economic support, even without the need for the government to take a very active role. Some of the expected outcomes of this is that by making this markets a little bit more official, that has led to a sort of institutionalized function of the market. And this has also led to an enhanced competitiveness for the companies and led to increased production output and better quality, which has also led to localization and some contribution to stable inflation levels. Some if we were to see what happened after the DPRK sanctions, if you look at this chart in 2017, this is on page 25, which is that after 2017, the localized products, as you can see, they have increased sharply, and also for a stabilization of prices, so for inflation, we can see that inflation levels have stabilized somewhat after 2017. So there are many different kinds of institutional changes, but because there is a limit to the resources and it's not easy to secure different raw materials, and that has had an impact on supply and has an impact on demand. And because the utilization rate of the factories is low, the spectrum of the changes of these economic institutions is quite broad, which means to say if the factories are not working anymore, right now the minimum wage is at 80,000 to about 180,000 won, but because the factory utilization rate is low, many of the workers are paid subpar levels, so below the minimum wage. And also this means that a lot of the reforms have been weakened thus far. So these are also some of the other sides, other aspects, what I wanted to show. And recently, under Kim Jong-un, people have said that the taxes have gone up, and some people might say that that goes against reforms, but these quasi-taxes have been applied to people because Kim Jong-un has been very much voicing his emphasis on the need for more capex and more investment. When there is a crisis which is something that occurs in an unexpected way, it's difficult to manage those risk levels. But for a lot of the other risks, they can be managed somewhat by instituting some changes to these different institutions. So with having these software development and developing ICBMs that target the U.S. mainland, they knew that the international community is going to place sanctions on them. So in a preemptive response to that, they might have thought about these different institutional overhauls because they anticipated the coming of these sanctions. I think that in the past, when we talk about sanctions, we haven't really discussed what the DPRK has done in preparation for upcoming sanctions. We really did not discuss the need for research looking into DPRK's anticipation of the sanctions and trying to prepare in advance against these sanctions. So hopefully, if I can maybe flesh out some of my research, I can provide you with a more insightful study in the future to see whether the DPRK, if we should do this in the approach of sanctions together with negotiations or have one or the other take the lead first. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee Young-hoon. You talked about the preemptive response or the preparation work that the DPRK might have done leading up to the sanctions, and what these different changes in the economic institutions would have on sanctions going forward.
Dr. Kim Il-han will give us a presentation on the assessment and the outlook for the agriculture and livestock industry of North Korea 2020.
고맙습니다. 이거 어떻게 넘기죠?
Could somebody help me control the slides? Good afternoon. I am from Dongguk University. I am Kim Il-han. Today, I would like to focus my talk on the agriculture sector of North Korea. I'll try to make my presentation as brief as possible. So what are the key words for the North Korean agriculture? That's flood and typhoon. And Dr. Choi is going to expound upon this later on. Nitrous fertilizers import have reduced greatly. So what are the implications on the overall agricultural environment in North Korea? If you look at the overall opinion that it's going to have some desperate impact on the agriculture. So we'll start with that question and begin the presentation. So there's a lot of restoration work going on to deal with the flood damages, especially for the agricultural lands. The restoration projects have been implemented quite quickly, and we're able to see the results as well. Especially during August, and actually starting from July, there were some monsoon damages and there were typhoon damages in September. They do look quite similar, but they're quite different in nature because the monsoon in August very much focused on Hwanghae-do and Hwanghan-namdo region, but for typhoon that was focused on the northern area of Hwanggyong. So that would be the eastern coastline of North Korea. So typhoon damage would only have a limited impact on agriculture produce because structurally speaking, there are a lot of mountains, there were a lot of mining fields that were affected, but actually the monsoon damage went across the grain belt, breadbasket. So the conclusion here is that in terms of the flood damage and typhoon damage on the agriculture, the impact was very limited in my view. These are the reasons why. If you can see from the graphs or the tables here, North Korea, of course, it's a political system. It's run by the party, and there's a central committee meeting. The fact that the meeting was held, that means that there are very important, serious matters at hand, and the diagnosis as well as the prescription would have to be made. And of course, the great leader, Kim Jong-un, would be part of that meeting. So these are the meetings that were held at the central party level. They were dealing with the flood damages as well as typhoon damages. And 5 such meetings were held throughout the year. So there were actually 10 meetings total over the year, course of a year, but 5 meetings were related to coming up with the response countermeasures for the flood damages as well as the typhoon damages. And if you look at the right part, 39,000 lots here were affected by the typhoon or the monsoon damages. So as you can see from the slide here, there were flood damages and typhoon damages, which the government really much focused on, and they very much focused on the recovery efforts going on. And I think the initial effort was pretty much concentrated on the agricultural lands, but there were some houses that were collapsed. Not so much the agricultural lands, but houses had to be rebuilt. So restoration project pretty much dealt with the reconstruction of the houses. And there were some on-site guidance and supervision as well. Well, the leader, of course, has a lot of roles to play from Alpha to Omega. For example, it is probably the power that be that would be visiting these different sites there. There were some on-site guidance conducted, 8 different places over here and 5 different places over here. And 8 of those visits were related to those areas that were damaged by flood and typhoon. So these visits were made by the leader, so 5 times as well as 3 times. So what do they really mean to us? Perhaps I should do a more in-depth study on this, but this is quite unprecedented. It's something that you would not see in the past North Korean history, and I don't think this is going to be repeated in the future. The fact that we had a really concentrated rounds of central party meetings, it's showing the commitment on the part of the North Korean government for restoration of the damaged areas, and there was a lot of policy efforts and assistance from the state as well. These are the photos taken from the flooded areas. So in August, Eunpa-gun, Daecheongri, this is a restored area. So this is the on-site guidance that was conducted on the 12th of September. And the place was restored, and the new houses were built here as a result. Photo taken in October. And this is from Gangwon-do, Gimhwa-gun region. And the restoration project was finished by the mid-October, rebuilding houses over here. So Kim Jong-un is actually going to these different places. And he's saying that to minimize damages to the agricultural lots, and these areas were able to, for example, yield greater produce from harvest. Of course, it may be a wishful thinking on the part of the North Korean side. My interpretation of this, of course, I mean, it could be very controversy. It could be quite controversial, but of course, he was there basically giving a lot of encouragement to people over there. It seems that he was very much giving a lot of inspirations to the workers over there to work harder, but he didn't seem to be taking a critical approach to that. This is the typhoon region, damaged region. Most of the areas over here are mining areas. You don't see any farms here. In Dancheon-si, Hamgyong-namdo region, a lot of houses were affected as some of the mines were inundated, flooded. Dr. Chan probably would know this better, but production linkages. So the transport path or the conveyor belts for the materials, they were broken down. So that was probably the biggest damage that we saw. But that area was completely restored by the middle of October. And here, the photo was taken on the 14th of October. So there was a first phase construction of the houses over here. So it is to be implemented until the end of this year. And there will be the 8th round of the political party convention, which will come up with the 5-year economic plan. The Kamdok or Donghae region, all of the houses over there were very outdated. And the state leader might want to, well, actually made a promise that they would work to rebuild 25 different housing lots. But of course, it was a top-down instruction. I think that's going to be announced as part of the meeting next year at the Workers' Party. Now, policy side, farm policy or agriculture policy with the new Kim Jong-un regime in place. In 2012, so that was actually the first year after Kim Jong-un came into power. On the 12th of June, they announced these measures. It's called June 12th measures. And the purchase system for the crops was changed, and I know it is going to be repeated by another speaker, but this is to give producers more profits and returns from their production activities. So the state purchase system would be reformed to give more profits back to the producers. Because there are more incentives to the farmers, there will be more profits in the end for them. And last year, in December of 2019, there was a 5th General Assembly there. There was a very critical period. That was the 5th round of the General Assembly there, which built a lot of momentum, and agriculture policy of North Korea was announced, which dealt with 5 different inputs for agricultural development for North Korea. This is compilation and integration of all the existing policies into one. So producers as well as consumers would be informed of the policies. So this is a synthesis of what they've been doing over the years. And about 4 out of the 5 inputs are related to infrastructure or resource development. And 1 input here, which was announced in 2012, related to distribution of proceeds for the producers. So the very important thing is that the chemical fertilizers, North Korea was, of course, importing these fertilizers in only a small amount. That would they be able to maintain the level of production needed? This is related to the fertilizers. and the North Korean government came together to have in-depth discussion on fertilizer needs. From the Rodong newspaper, for example, excluding all of the just rhetorics, for example, the supreme leader, the beloved leader, and so forth. I think the most frequently used words related to industry would be fertilizers or organic fertilizers. So basically, my point is, of course, many people are saying that the agriculture sector in North Korea is in complete collapse, but I don't think so because I have quite a different view. And I think they've done pretty good job in maintaining their economy. And I have to be very careful in what I say because I'm surrounded by very renowned experts over here. But basically, my point is, according to the article that was announced in 2020, this is called 농금맹, which is the Union of Agriculture Workers of Korea. There was an article in the newspaper said that they have this annual end of the year meeting that they overachieved the targets for the grains production for the year. That was an announcement that they made. And of course, maybe it is a mix of their anticipation, wishful thinking, but still, this was released by a very responsible organization of North Korea, the meeting that was dealing with the actual results of production. I'm sure it was not completely groundless. So, of course, again, the most important thing here is a focus on fertilizers. In 2019, I think that they already were able to come up with a breakthrough in terms of the fertilizer. In 2016, although we're not very fully aware of, that they have met their expected volume, the demand. So from 2016 to 2020, ever since Kim Jong-un came into power, and of course we have to remember that there was no such announcement before. There were 3 extraordinary announcements made in a short period of 5 years. So what does that mean? I wouldn't want to give my personal interpretation of this as for the ulterior motive, but at any way, this very official meeting, this responsible party officials saying that they overachieved the targets probably is a representation of enhanced confidence amongst the people there.
자, 비료와 곡식
So here, fertilizers and grains. True that there has been a decline in the import of grains, especially in the first half of this year. This is explained in the graph on the left side. And this is the grains market price on the right side. Dr. Choi, I know that she will be introducing this slide as well. So I know she's going to be dealing with this, so I'm not going to go into details. So basically, the market prices have stabilized, even if there's a significant decline in import of grains. This is processed food. This is based on the first half of the year result. So we have to see until the end of the year to see any meaningful results. But we don't see much differences in terms of market prices. Next, fertilizers. Import here has dropped significantly. This is a compilation that's NPK plus NPK. That's a combined of fertilizers mixing NPK. Even if there was a significant drop, the market price for the nitrogen fertilizers, it seems to be leveling off. So it's becoming quite difficult to really understand what is going on in North Korea because you really have to see what's behind these official figures. So it's very difficult to come up with the accurate interpretation of the status of the North Korean economy. So for the chemical fertilizers, there are 2 nitrogen fertilizer flagged, Hungnam and Cheonglin chemical plant fertilizers, chemical fertilizer plants there. So these 2 plants there over the last 3-year period, they had a ramp-up construction, 2 rounds, and they have been saying that they have met their production volume after the ramp-up construction. So whether it's credible data or not, at least the announcement was made, points to the fact that there's a level of credence. Next is organic fertilizer. The government kept saying before that just try to produce more, try to manufacture more, but now it's being done at different local governments, local levels, at different cooperative farms. The state is telling them to come up with their own complexes, produce organic fertilizers and distribute them to those local communities. There are very specific top-down orders coming down. And also production bases and plants are being constructed at different levels and units of the cities. And this was announced by a newspaper in a newspaper article in 2020. And this is being done in a very systematic manner. In the past, they really didn't have any plan in place, but it seems to have changed. So let's take a look at the outlook for agriculture next year. They have begun construction of the phosphorus fertilizer plant. Now, to build this plant, you need phosphorus materials. These materials would be needed as a feedstock. All of these mines, they have been just left overlooked, are completely restored, and they have begun production from this plant from November. That means phosphorus and fertilizer plant will be up and running starting next year. So nitrogen fertilizers and phosphorus and fertilizers will be able to make enough volume for the level of organic fertilizers, so the situation will only improve starting next year. And in next year's 5-year plan will probably deal with a different type of fertilizer here. This was also mentioned directly by the state leader, Kim Jong-un. So the 3 different type of chemical fertilizers plus a very systematic organic fertilizer, putting all of these factors together, North Korea will be able to come up with a very significant amount of fertilizer production, which will support the agricultural development of North Korea. Another important factor is that there were these areas that have been flooded. Many agricultural lands were inundated. And to prevent this issue, these rivers and streams are now being realigned in a very systematic and structured manner recently, especially the river banks and small reservoirs, the beams. These facilities have been reformed and restructured, and they really went a long way towards preventing any massive flood damage. I think this is only going to scale up. It will be done in a very systematic manner. And they're also trying to increase tidal flats. It's still going on as we speak. There was an announcement of a 5-year tidal flat development along the west coast areas to find new lands.
간석지죠. 자, 어쨌든
So my conclusion is, I'm sorry I've used up a lot of time. In 2020, looking at the agriculture production of North Korea, it is common view that they have probably reached or near the planned amount for agriculture production. It is driven by the systematic agriculture policy development, and predictability has also been enhanced, and this is only going to increase in the future. Third is that as a result of this, the infrastructures will be continuously strengthened and expanded for agriculture production, but still there are certain tasks that need to be addressed. There has to be a sustainability and stability in terms of the implementation of agriculture policy. It may be related to funding, finance, as well as resources, how the policies themselves are going to be managed. And second is to establishing the relevant infrastructures for these agricultures. For example, going back to the 5-year tidal flat development, there has to be a stable flow of finance to develop the infrastructures. So it's all about financing, funding. Third is related to inter-Korean cooperation project. Now we have to take a very long-term horizon here. And agriculture really requires a lot of time for any outputs to really be visible. And there are also a variety of technologies and skills needed. In that regards, international cooperation as well as cooperation with North Korea would have to cover this area for sure. And the agriculture development as well as chemical fertilizers. And there are many organic fertilizers that are in access to production in South Korea that have nowhere to go because there are no consumers here. I understand about 1/3 of those organic fertilizers are in access supply. So we could do something about it rather than just giving rice to North Koreans. We could also use it as an instrument for facilitating our cooperation with North Korea. I think a mid to long-term plan will be needed. And of course, I'm sure North Korea is putting their heads around that as well, something that we should consider. Thank you very much. That was quite a long presentation, but I will end my presentation here. Thank you.
예, 길었습니다.
Yes, that was very long.
He was basically saying that there have been a lot of concerns, a lot of voice of concerns over there, and Dr. Kim said that it's not exactly true what people think is going on in North Korea, that things have actually improved over the years.
Next, we would like to hear about the situation with the light industry from Choi Eun-ju of the Sejong Institute.
예, 안녕하세요.
Hello, my name is Choi Eun-ju of Sejong Institute. Today I'm going to be talking about the light industry sector. So here my presentation states the recent changes and trends in the DPRK economic policies, specifically in the light industry. After 2013, there have not been many marked policy changes in the light industry sector, which is why I said I wanted to talk about some of the recent changes in the trends. I want to talk about the different issues and the problems that the DPRK had in terms of its light industry, and talk about what they tried to do and what kinds of different policy matters they try to undertake, and the different changes that we can expect from this. When we look at the light industry, under Kim Jong-un in 2013, he gave a speech at the National Light Industry Workers Congress, and at the speech he tried to present a vision or a blueprint about light industry for the country in the future. And that blueprint that he presented in 2013 has continued to remain the same thus far. With the light industry, it's the sector that makes consumer goods. In the DPRK, it's about textiles, paper, shoes, clothes. These are some of the things that are made in the DPRK's light industry sector. Instead of coming up with very detailed policy matters for each subsector, Kim Jong-un wanted to look at a very broad-based vision for light industry as a whole, and that is what he tried to present at this speech. Under the Kim Jong-un era, one of the big changes that we saw in the light industry sector is that there is a lot of depletion across many different resources and many different areas. So there is a lack of raw materials to make the consumer goods, and there is a depletion, that is to say, a lack in the terms of quality and the quantity of the goods. We often talk about the lack of capacity infrastructure, the lack of different facilities in the factories, but even if the factories are there, they are very antiquated. They are not modernized. So there are three major policies that I can talk about: localization, modernization, and quality enhancement. Within these, there are some of the characteristics that we can think about in terms of production. There is a modernization of production facilities or factories. Because it will take a very long time to build a factory from scratch, they have been trying to modernize existing factories. And another thing is that different production lines or these facility lines within existing factories, they try to modernize individual lines instead. Another is that they want to try to do a replacement for imports. They want to try to localize much of their goods production using their own in-house production facilities to try to produce goods within the country, using as much as they can the raw materials that they can find within DPRK. So that localization of both the facilities and localization of the raw materials have been the focal point of their policies. And then I also want to talk about re-resourcification. As the DPRK has said, there's a lot of these different depletion and lack of resources and lack of different goods and raw materials, which is why they have been trying to make use of waste and see that as an asset, try to discover any resources that are underused or not being used and try to put them into work as raw materials to try to create them into new resources, so sort of a resourcification. And this has been very much emphasized under Kim Jong-un, particularly together with these different projects. Kim Jong-un has said that this is a way to try to have economic development while also cutting down on waste, which will ultimately help them towards environmental protection. There are 5 different detailed subsectors under this area. So under the modernization of the production facilities, as I mentioned before, while there are some new factories that are coming online, the DPRK is trying to work hard to modernize existing facilities, existing factories. So for the production facilities, they're trying to cut down on labor and cut down on energy so that they can solve these issues of a lack of labor and lack of energy. And they want to make use of resources such as waste resources or recycled resources so that they can reuse these resources. With the re-resourcification, they can use technologies to try to enhance the outputs of the resources, but they've also been placing an emphasis on gathering and collecting the waste and other underused resources. And based on what we've seen on the media, the work of trying to collect these different waste materials and the underused materials is not exactly going very smoothly. If there is a factory that emits waste resources, if they can reuse that, that'd be great. But Kim Jong-un and the regime has also stressed that different factories and production facilities should be able to share and reuse these different resources. But it's not just factories and industries, but the citizens themselves should also try to provide these resources and different waste materials that are not being used so that they can be put to use in production. But in fact, this is not going to be something that is just going to be donated for free. They have been thinking about putting a pricing scheme on this so that these waste resources and waste materials can be sold at cost. When this was first announced in 2013, the DPRK has really stressed the importance of increased production. They wanted to try to create many more goods so that the supply can meet the demand. However, recently, some of the changes that we were able to see is that more so than increased production is the enhancement in quality. And so they've been stressing the importance of quality, that production comes after quality. As Lee Hyung-hoon said in his presentation, that within these different changes in the institutions, we're also seeing that many citizens at the DPRK, the residents, are used to better quality goods. And there's a demand for better quality goods. And the industry should try to meet this demand by trying to create better quality goods. And the DPRK said is even if you try to create a lot of goods, if they are not of good quality and they have to be thrown away, then that is just all going to be a waste. So the DPRK has tried to stress the need to create quality goods that can really meet the demand of the residents. So recently, we've also seen the rise in DPRK of what we call low quantity, better quality volume production. With light industry, I know that compared to the other heavy industries and other sectors, there's also light industry in different local regions. So this is spread out nationwide. There are very small-scale production plants across DPRK that can have a production of these different goods that can fulfill the local demand. When the central local industry supply does not really fit with cannot meet the demand, then the local side can also be stepped up to meet that demand at the local level. And the local regions would try to make use of their different characteristic raw materials to try to create good quality products that can later be sold at the central level, which would ultimately go back to contribute to a local development. And so they come up with different sources and different raw materials to try to facilitate this and to try to create more local development. Gangwon-do province has been seen as a model industry in this regard. A lot of the light industry sectors in Gangwon-do province are being shown as a model case. For this local light industry, they want to try to have good quality management. This is going to be a very important challenge going forward, and the DPRK is emphasizing the importance of sharing the knowledge and expertise at the central level with the local level light industry sectors. That maybe the central level professionals and the officials can be sent and dispatched to the local areas, local sectors, so that they can provide more information and expertise. And this would help with the local capacity building, local capacity development. This last slide here shows that in the distribution of the finished products and the goods, earlier on, they've been talking about the modernization of the production facilities and the plants, but because of COVID-19, there must have been some changes brought to these plans, although we have no access to the information regarding this. But the DPRK has said the importance of a streamlined organization so that they can be more flexible and nimble towards any changes. And the DPRK has said that they need to look into different institutional changes and may be warranted because of the different challenges. And they had to come up with different strategies to create goods that can appeal to the consumers. So they don't use words like advertising or marketing, but they use a similar terminology in saying that the goods have to be made of good quality so that they can have appeal and they can be sold to the consumers. And also with reuse or re-resourcification for the waste materials or underused materials that are not being used at home, if you can take that to an exchange center, a purchasing goods exchange center, then they can exchange that with something else that you actually need to use in your residence. And this is also something that is being done at a nationwide level. And this is where consumers and corporations can work together.
2020년을 중심으로 좀 사용.
So in these areas, earlier on in 2020, some of the things that we were able to see is that we have not been able to see a lot of official statistics. So we have been trying to piece together different news articles from Rodong Shinmun and different state news outlets. The facility modernization is something that the DPRK has continued to do over the years. And around November and December, they usually make announcements about new production plants that are going to come online. So we've been trying to look for all these different news articles There was a Haesang kimchi plant that was completed in October, but other than that, we have not heard news of more completed new production facilities. However, early this year, DPRK has said that they're going to create a general hospital, a Pyongyang General Hospital, but we still don't know whether that has actually been built. So even when it comes to light industry, when it comes to the modernization of existing production plants and of facilities, it must be difficult for the central government to provide more funding and assistance towards this. So we feel that the plans are still being implemented, but it's difficult to have access and have visibility towards these different plans. However, we have been able to see some progress made in the re-resourcification or reuse of resources. They've tried to come up with different facilities or new lines where they can make use of old resources or waste resources, and there has been some good performance in that regard. So this could go some way towards helping the resource deficiency of the DPRK. And earlier on with the quality, as I mentioned before, it's also important to enhance quality, but it's also being stressed to standardize quality management. And there's also been mentioned that the state agency in charge of this would have expanded capacities. So the National Quality Management Committee should have more and stronger a capacity to try to manage quality, is what the DPRK has said, and that different companies should have a quality goal, a quality objective for this to be met. However, even if this is actually met, we still don't know how to tie that in with rating the performance of the companies. But the efforts of trying to tie in quality with production will likely continue going forward. And we just heard about the situation in Gangwon-do I just mentioned, but recently in Samjeon City, there's been some factories there, and some of these factories and production facilities have also been praised as model sites, as model cases. And early this year, there has been an announcement that more of these model cases will be announced, but we have not been able to see whether there's a lot of achievements in this regard as well. However, we have still been able to hear some word about local light industry, primarily on F&B. So we might be able to see better quality coming out from the different local light industry sectors across DPRK. So we might be able to hear more news of this in the future. And in the recovery of a socialist commerce, as I mentioned before, in Chosun Shinbo earlier this year, they talked about how Pyongyang is going to be the center for a socialist commerce and that they're actually adopting various different supermarkets. In the past, a consumer would go and ask for certain goods to be placed before him, and it would be the merchant, the sales associate, who would go get the goods. But now there are more supermarkets that are coming online. The displays of these groceries and the goods are looking a little bit different, and the consumers can actually pick and choose the item that they want to choose. And this is also something that's a new development that we've been able to see in the DPRK. So this is what we've seen in light industry. These are some of the different state-planned initiatives that we've been able to see. Rather than a central level making all of these aggressive investments, some of the different factories and the production facilities have been making the investments themselves, and the state has been trying to encourage the private level investment into this. And hopefully this would actually lead to a virtuous cycle where the factories that have been modernized will continue to do better, and then they will continue to see better production and better profit. But we feel that this could also lead to a gap in productivity between different factories and between different production facilities. So when there is a gap, there's going to be a polarization. Those factories that are seeing better accomplishment, better achievement, will continue to do well. But we have not been able to see a lot of factories with underachievements. So there is a disparity between the different factories. However, if we take a look at what has been reported, the factories that have been modernized continue to see an increase in their production. And from November, when the 80-day battle continues, the different factories and the different production facilities will be evaluated on the progress and on their achievement, and then that results will be updated. Recently, we've seen a lot of individual and team level achievements, but we have not really been able to see a lot of reports about factory level achievement. We still have about 1 month left to go, but this centrally planned economy for light industry, we still have to wait until the first half of next year to hear the evaluation. However, there are some areas that we can anticipate, which is
그래서 경공업
that with COVID-19 early on this year, a lot of the big challenges for light industry is that they had to make a lot of sanitizers, PPE, face masks, and etc., different disease control goods. And the light industry sector has been stressing the importance of manufacturing these different supplies. And this manufacture is going to continue together. However, it's difficult for them to import the necessary raw materials to make this. And so there's been a lot of pressure on the light industry sector. Beginning in August, the different resources and goods. There's also been a stressing of the supply for these goods. And so there's been a lot of support to try to make this happen, and a lot of companies will face a sort of a production crunch on trying to create all this. We have not been able to see a lot of visible derailments in the production process of all of these different production facilities, but this means that there's going to be a destabilization of the operations of the production facilities.
로는 북한이 이렇게 딱 총체적으로 정리해서 내진 않지만
And also, the DPRK has not really said it as much, very explicitly, but the press has said that there are different factories making plans on modernization, and if we were trace them and track them, we still have not been able to hear any progress reports on these modernization plans for the production facilities for the factories. So even with the light industry, it feels that their production output is going to be relatively stable going into next year as well. But from the mid to long term, whether or not they can continue to guarantee the same level of production output is something that remains in flux. And this means that there's going to be a lot of pressure on the light industry sector in the future. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다. 예.
Thank you very much. So we're supposed to have 7 presentations for this session. But of course, I mean, we had to spend some time going over the proceedings. But after 3 presentations, we have already used that 1 hour. So as a moderator, I have to do a very effective time management. But perhaps I'm not doing a good job. So speakers, please be sure to finish your presentation within 10 minutes. Once again. Next, we're going to look at the performance and the outlook for 2020 North Korea industry sector. Kim Soo-jung from the Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade, KIET.
네, 안녕하십니까. 산업연구원의
Hello, I am a researcher on North Korean industries from KIET, Kim Soo-jung. I will take a look at the industry of North Korea, especially the backbone industry, which is power, coal, metal, and chemical industry. What have been their performance so far, and what are their outlooks for 2021? As you understand, the backbone industries, we use the word 산업 in Korea, and North Koreans use the term 공업, but they pretty much mean the same thing. So this is a fundamental industry that would make up any economy. So for example, in South Korea, we have had some changes in terms of the backbone industries. First, we had the textile, fashion industry that was a backbone industry. We used to have a machinery industry that was driving the economy. Now we're trying to move towards the fourth industrial revolution era. But still, North Korea, their backbone industries, the fundamental industries are power, the electricity, coal, and metal, and chemical industries. In order to run these industries, you need to have a lot of inputs, production inputs. First of all, you need machines, and you need fuel. Such as, for example, crude oil as well as coal, but they're unable to get a lot of imports due to the sanctions regime. So to operate these Backbone industries, they're not in a good condition. But to give you an overview of what is going on in North Korea in relation to the industrial development, so the machines are no longer being imported in North Korea, and crude oil is not coming in, but still North Korea is able to muddle through. They're still able to manage their industry as is. We're not exactly sure how long they will be able to survive, but the outlook is not very bright. And I will follow that up with my following slides. Let's take a look at the power industry. This is their key priority in terms of their breakthrough wall, because they need power so that they can run these industry facilities or industrial facilities. So for now, they want to ramp up their production for power, and they want to distribute them sufficiently to needed areas. They need to have the right technologies as well as the pipelines through remodeling as well as repair. And they're trying to increase their production of power. That's been the target of the North Korean government with a lot of policies, and there have been some results to date. What's really noticeable is that renewable energies are now being introduced into North Korea in a larger scale. But of course, the power that's produced from renewable sources is only limited, quite patchy as well, just only being implemented in certain regions of the country. So the volume is quite limited. But the fact that they're now focusing on renewable energy really means a lot, because a CO2 carbon footprint could be reduced, and at the same time, they don't really have to import on imported fuel to still produce their power. So this is only going to be increased in the future. And I'm also looking at a technical aspect of this, the engineering side of it, but I know I don't have much time to go into that. So I will just talk about some of the key technologies here for the power industry. They're trying to reduce their reliance on crude oil, heavy fuel oil. It is to bypass the sanctions regime imposed on North Korea. For example, large-scale coal-fired power plants are introducing these different innovative technologies there to reduce their reliance on crude oil. So will they be able to meet the target for power production? Well, over the short-term period, they will not be able to achieve the goal. The reasons were already explained before. It is because of the machines imports, and also the fuel imports are absolutely necessary inputs for the production. Now, the foundation is very shaky there. And North Korea is not in a very positive position to manufacture their own machines. They would only have to just repair and maintain the already imported machines from abroad. But we're not exactly sure how long they will be able to survive with those machines. So the future doesn't look to be very bright. But from the renewable side, there's a lot of technologies, investment, as well as facilities. So if there's a lot of technological cooperation with South Korea, perhaps things could turn out to be better. What about coal production? This is also a prerequisite for building up the people economy in North Korea. So producing a lot of coal really helps in terms of power production, because of the coal-fired plant need coals to run their facilities. So you need to have a lot of coal supply so that you can run these plants, and you can also produce fertilizers. That is why North Korea is trying to develop as much coal as possible. So they're developing and exploring these different minefields. The key area that they're focusing on is that they're trying to increase the sophisticatedness or advancement of their machines. For example, the coal carriers and belt conveyor system is being introduced very actively. These automations are not installed at these mines. It's just an evidence or testimony to the fact that their industries are very outdated. So what about the current situation in terms of coal production? We don't see much announcements made for the ramp-up of the coal production, so the picture is not really clear on this front. But the anthracite production or the export of anthracite to China has stopped. So if it is used for its internal demand, then it could mean that they're using more from their internal market, but we're unable to know for sure. Of course, here I'm saying that the ramp-up production is possible, but we're not exactly sure whether that really occurred. But there could have been a higher demand for anthracite in North Korea. And North Korea is now continuously investing in relevant machines. So with those infrastructures in place, North Korea will be able to produce more coal. So the outlook could be quite bright. But without having these machines in place, the coal production increase may not be possible. Next, moving on to metal industry. Metal industry was an area a lot of experts were focusing on. They had the Supreme People's Assembly meeting this year. They said that they wanted to prioritize their effort on metal industry development with a lot of policy support. And they call it the localized steel. It's called juche steel, that they're going to improve the quality of steel, and they will also increase the production of juche steel. And also the new type of a floating oxygen type of furnace was to be developed, but we don't see much announcements made to that effect. That means that we're not really positive about any progress having been made by North Korea in terms of the ramp-up production for coal. So you could refer to these slides here. So there isn't much to share on this front, and the outlook isn't very bright either. There are a lot of iron core coal reserved, but you need to have the steel making process that follows. But it really needs a high level of technology, needs a lot of fuel, resources, as well as power. So they need to have a very strong power industry to be able to run this coal industry effectively. Next, chemical industry, together with metal industry. These are the two main pillars that were to drive the economy forward. The carbon hana the industry is to be developed by North Korea. They are also going to build a very massive, large-scale methanol plant. What are some of the results here? Suncheon phosphorus fertilizer plant was completed of construction. They also carried out construction for ramp-up for some of the production facilities. Yes, they're developing technologies to set up this Hana plant. This is called C1 chemical. This is a technology that is currently in development, not a finished technology. So I don't think North Korea will be able to successfully complete the development of this C1 technology. But there is some know-how being accumulated in the process, which could still be applicable to other adjacent industries. So we can say that that is quite positive and that it could have good ripple effects to other industries. So Tanso Hana plant, they're to produce organic chemicals, but mostly on fertilizers. So in terms of chemical fertilizers, there's production expansion there. So expanded production, obviously coming from the fertilizers. I've already touched upon the ramp-up element here. We need to take a look at the overall performance of chemical industry according to Rodong Shinmun article from August. Now, the chemical industry was not functioning properly because of lack of strategic focus and business performance. So it is their self-evaluation that chemical industry didn't really perform as planned. It is because the only result that we can really say regarding the chemical industry is fertilizer. But this is actually related to adjacent industries such as power, machine, metals, and so forth. And also in August and also in September, there were natural disasters that affected various production inputs, and all these production inputs had to be reallocated to restore the flooded areas. And lastly, my conclusion page here. So on top of the sanctions regime, there were border closures due to COVID-19 and also natural disasters. The production inputs, raw materials, and equipment were not introduced in a timely manner in the North Korean economy, leading to lack of performance in backbone industry, especially for the metal industry and chemical industries. Thank you, and that concludes my presentation.
예, 감사합니다. 네, 김수정 박사님께서는 아까 앞에
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Just like Dr. Choi, the backbone industries in North Korea, quite similar to light industries. They're struggling, but they're not in a crisis situation. But things don't look very bright going forward. There may be some aggravated issues going forward. So thank you.
에 대해서
Next, we'd like to hear about the situation of science and technology in the DPRK from Byun-hak Moon.
예, 한국과학기술정보연구원의
Hello, my name is Byun-hak Moon. I'm from the Korean Institute of Science and Technology Information. Because we are very much behind schedule, I'm going to go right into my presentation. Last year, at the end of the last year, the Workers' Party Congress was held, and they talked about this all-out war, or sort of a breakthrough situation. Because they know that they are under this sanctions regime, and they said that they're going to try to get out of it using their own self-sufficiency and their own power. And they said that they're going to turn to science and technology to try to allow them to get out of that. And this is going to be their breakthrough. Because they understand that we are living in a knowledge economy, and the growth engine of any economy comes from knowledge, science, and technology. So they want to make use of science and technology to try to get out of this sanctions regime, and they want to develop science and technology in that regard. That is their logic, and this is not something that was just done overnight at the end of last year. This is something that Kim Jong-un has continued to proceed, and this is also a sort of a learning process that they had over the last 7 years. In the mid to late 50s, when DPRK wanted to try to engage in self-sufficiency, that's when things took a turn between them and the Soviet Union. But they were successful in trying to have a more self-sufficiency in that regard. And with that learning, with that lesson, they were able to see that science and technology is a way for them to help get out of this situation. We feel that with instances like the Kaesong Industrial Complex, we think that they have a lot of labor, but that's not the case. Their population has always been 50% that of us, and this has actually gone down after the 50s, and their external economic situation has also worsened. So for them to try to get a new growth engine is to try to develop science and technology on their own. And this is their new perspective, and this has become stronger recently. At the end of the 1990s, when their economy really collapsed, they've already witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so that's when Kim Jong-il also talked about the importance of science and technology, which is why his son has also done the same. They want to try to use science and technology to try to get a breakthrough out of the situation. And this is also something that is based on these last 2 decades, what they've witnessed and what they've learned over the years. However, DPRK has been very critical and very objective about evaluating their own science and technological levels. If they want to try to get out of the sanctions regime on their own, they need to have very high levels of science and technology, but they're still not there. And they're very explicit in saying this, that right now we are trying to do our best to try to support science and technology, but our science and technology levels are still very low, and that is why they're not contributing actively to the economic development. And also, they've also been saying the importance of science and technology development for about 20 years, but they've only been talking about that in different roundtables and in the meeting rooms, but they have not actually translated themselves to concrete achievements in science and technology. They've been very critical of their achievements over the years, and that is why at the end of last year, they said that they should start to do better. And they've come up with 2 responses to this, as I understand. First, in the long term, there is this lack of capacity, and there is this attitude of the party elite to scientists, so they have to sort of change that. So first of all, with the capacity deficiency, it's not something that they can solve overnight. So at the National Teachers Congress, which was held last year, they said that our science and technological levels are low because our education levels are low, and the education levels are low because the teachers' capacity is low. And so to try to overcome that, they have to start out by increasing the capacity of the teachers. So from the mid to long term, they've said that they're going to try to enhance the capacity of the teachers and the instructors, which will ultimately lead to an enhancement of science and technological progress. Even if that's their long-term vision, they have the 5-year economic development plan and different this year's different economic initiatives. So they have to make use of the existing capacities, be very efficient with the use of that to try to solve the situation that they're seeing right now. And to do so, they've decided to go with the party elites. Instead of having the party elites just talk rhetoric about the importance of science and technology, they want the party elite to try to do something practical on the ground. And the party has instructed them to learn about science and technology themselves so that the party elites would, after they know that when the party officials know about science and technology, then they can have a proper conversation with the scientists and engineers. So that's the short-term project to try to enhance the awareness level and the expertise level of the party officials and the party elites, while in the mid to long-term basis, they're going to focus more and invest in education. In the early part of this year, they did not come up with a very specific plan for science and technological progress, but if you take a look at this chart later on, this is based on my findings with the media outlets, media reports. So there's about 30 different kinds of news articles that were released, and there's about dozens of core national tasks that have been announced. And I think that there are probably specific tasks or projects per each sector. But this was announced in January. Usually, this is typically done at the end of a year, but the National Science and Technology Committee had submitted a progress report last year, which they were criticized on. So they resubmitted the report, resubmitted the plan, which was later confirmed in the first part of this year. With the lack of capacity of the scientists and engineers and the attitude situation and the attitude of the party cadre, of the elites, that has also been addressed with this plan. So it appears that this is a very serious reflection into their actual lack of capacity. And they tried to come up with a plan, but things did not go well because of COVID-19. COVID-19 hit, and this was really severe. Beginning in February, they've basically pulled all of their science and technological resources to try to have a quarantine, to do in disease control against COVID-19. And a lot of the different organizations, let's say, if you are making precision machinery, then they have been changed and transitioned to make PPEs or different kinds of quarantine equipment. And they also have to engage in disease control. The state had been very busy in disease control, so this plan on science and technological progress has sort of been undermined by COVID-19. On the Rodong Shinmun's articles, there are about 199 different news articles last year about science and technology, but that has been cut down to about 1/3. And a lot of these different science and technological articles are about COVID-19. So we have not seen a lot of media reports about science and technological progress this year. It appears to show that there hasn't been a lot of achievements made in this sector. And as I mentioned before, this national plan with these core tasks that was criticized once and was reconfirmed, it appears that all of these tasks are being implemented right now. But only one institution has said that they have completed the policy task commissioned by the government, but it doesn't show what kind of task it was. So I don't know if there was actually a completion of the task or not, but in any case, these tasks, these core tasks, have not been completed in full. And as Dr. Choi mentioned, and as Dr. Kim mentioned, but there is this use of new renewable energy and reuse of resources. This is something that you can do immediately at the different units to try to get out of the sanctions regime. So this has been a little bit expanded, but for the other areas, we have not been able to see a lot of progress. However, for the teaching side, at least on the surface, beginning in September after the teachers' convention, after the teachers' assembly, and then later at the Workers' Party Congress, they've had these different discussions and mentions of investing in education. So this is something that is actually going on, it appears to seem. They've been talking about investing in capacity building. They've been talking about the importance of human resources in science and technology. In early 2000, when Kim Jong-il was trying to do a selection of party cadre, he said that loyalty is important, but also as important is to try to choose the smartest people, to try to choose university graduates. But now, the party officials are said to have at least enough scientific and technological expertise as scientists and engineers. No, this is the objective that the state has, but the actual realities are quite different. So I do have a case example that you can see in my presentation material. Oh, I don't know what exactly is going to happen next year. I think, in fact, the answer is already there, that we already know what's going to happen. That a lot of these different issues that they want to implement will not be readily implemented because of the sanctions regime, first of all. And if they don't have a lot of labor capital, then they have no choice but to try to enhance the capacity of science and technology. And so this is really going to be the only thing that they can emphasize in the future. And I think it was at the end of October when we listened to when we read the op-ed of the Rodong Shinmun. They said that this can be an opportunity for them to try to enhance their self-capacity and their self-sufficiency. So at the Workers' Congress that is going to be held in January, they're going to stress the importance of science and technology. I did not add this in my presentation, but I am looking into to try to do innovation of the scientists and engineers, but that means that there's also going to be failure. If you're trying to make new and innovative attempts, you are bound to fail. But is DPRK the kind of country where you can allow failure? They talk about what's called faithful failure, but is this faithful failure something that the DPRK regime is really able to embrace? And also with the renewable energy developments and the reuse of resources that they've tried to implement this year, a lot of the different elites have talked about the importance of this, but there are two issues. One is that there's too much focus on the immediate profit to try to have relentless development without the need for environmental protection. And another is that different institutions, based on mid to long-term goals, are not really looking into important research objectives. They're only looking at the most immediate research objectives. Unless this is properly solved, then there is going to actually be a waste of resources. And this is something that we would have to look at DPRK doing in the next year. Yes, that was a presentation on the science and technology area. This has always been an issue for the DPRK, but under Kim Jong-un, they've been really stressing the importance of enhancing the capacity of science and technology to try to have a balanced evaluation, and that's what he provided.
선에 대해서
Next, we're going to invite Dr. Choi Jang-ho from Kiev to talk about the trade between the DPRK and China from January till September this year. Good afternoon. I'm from Kiev. I am Choi Jang-ho. My presentation is titled From January till September this year. I will share with you the results of trade between DPRK and China. Before we look at the trade data, I want to remind you, first of all, is that you've probably learned from the assessment so far is that they have a domestic economy, domestic demand, and external economy. But the domestic demand is not really confronting a very positive outlook. Not the external economy, but the domestic economy is doing better. But in terms of trade, it's in a very desperate situation. but it is being used as a leading indicator that it is bound to show a lot of volatilities and variabilities, and that trade index really is not a fair representation of the complete picture of the North Korean economy. There have been a lot of volatilities here. And in 2016, we could use that as a base year. It is before the sanctions regime began. And in 2018 and 2019, the economy was heavily affected by the sanctions regime. But in 2019, the economy grew quite adapted to it. But in 2020, there was that unpredictable factor posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the overall trade was heavily affected by the pandemic. So again, 2016 income was $2.2 billion. Export was $1.8 billion. But in 2020, this is from January till September, income $400 million, which is 87% from 2016. And export is less than 100 million. It is $43.85 million, so which is 97.6% fall from 2016. So import dropped dramatically, and export actually virtually came to a halt. This is month-to-month trend. We can see this from two different angles. One, up until June. The light gray colors are the changes from 2020. Now, the trade volumes over here in the first 2 months are the same. It is because China actually released the figures combining both of the months. So we have just divided them by 2 months, and that is why we see the same figures. January was normal, but in February there was a very significant drop, and then it began to increase again until June. And we also did a run analysis for October, but import and export actually came to a halt. So virtually in October, import and export were virtually non-existent. So in March of this year, and I think they had believed that they would be able to resume their import and export in June and July. So there were some efforts made by North Korea to resume their activities. But Liaoning Shang had an infection again with COVID. So the number of cases began to go up. So they decided to shut their borders again. So they stopped their import and export trade at all. So they did not, for example, stop the trade because of external factors, but they actually decided on their own volition because of the COVID-19 fears. Now, one of the big characteristics this year is that there is a lot of herd behavior towards agriculture, higher Engel index, because agriculture is about 10% of the total economy in North Korea. But up until September, that portion increased to 45%. So they only focused on feeding themselves, and they were unable to import any goods from overseas. So what are they feeding themselves with? Soybean oil, wheat, and sugar, glucose, or sugar canes. So what's driving this? Who are, for example, importing wheat and who are importing soybean oils? Are they being imported by the private sector or public sector? That would be something important to consider. But on an external point, up until June of this year, North Korea was taking a policy to maintain the level of food import, but right now, the agricultural import came to a virtual stop. So I think the private sector was leading that import of food. And how was that possible? Because starting from 2016, Commissioner Kim Jong-un, Chairman Kim Jong-un, focused on a movement to increase the quality of their food. And he gave an instruction to do a lot of local production of the snacks. And I think the appetite of the consumers over there really changed. Rather than having lots of corns, and they prefer wheat. And I think that really drove the production of wheat. And due to COVID-19, they closed down their borders, but there was a purchasing power coming from the private sector, which led the import of the agricultural products, but it came to a complete stop after October. Next is apparel and textile. Up until 2019, from 2016, the textiles are used for processing trades. But in 2020, there was a significant drop in import. 2018 and 19, even despite that there were sanctions regime, they were not able to export their products, but they still imported a lot of raw materials. Was it for their domestic demand, or were they doing just smuggling? So there were a lot of controversies. But the fact that the import came to a halt, that means that despite the sanctions in 2018 and 19, that there were smuggling of the apparels as well as textiles back then, but due to COVID-19, the North Korean regime, in fear of the COVID-19, just gave a direct order to stop the trade of processing trade. The transport, steel, iron, the metals, the import virtually stopped in 2018 due to the sanctions regime, and also other industrial inputs, their import has also decreased as well. Next, fireproof bricks import. As I mentioned before, the import until June of 2020, the economy was doing okay, and they were quite optimistic that they would be able to resume their import, and this was reflected in their policy. But in June, we could not see any evidence of North Korea taking any policy efforts. Case in point is fireproof bricks. They can withstand very high temperature, usually used for power generation plants. In the first half of the year, we had a lot of construction for those power plants, and you would have to run turbines, and they would need a lot of fireproof bricks that would have to withstand such high temperature, the heat coming from. But the import virtually stopped after June. Next is raw materials needed for medical purposes. September, for example, there was a 1,000% increase in terms of import for the medical materials, pharmaceutical materials. But if you just look at the volume per se, if you look at the import volume in 2019 compared to 2018 and 17, there was a marginal drop in import. And also due to COVID-19, because of the construction of the Pyongyang General Hospital, we think that the import for medical goods probably was increased, and that's what the newspapers are saying. But actually, import decreased. So even the priority area for the North Korean regime was affected by the COVID-19 triggered recession. So trade with China or export to China, the volume is very limited. So we would rather not include that in the calculation. So there was a significant drop in processing trade, especially after 2018 and 19 due to the sanctions. Export of the mobile, the watch movements increased significantly. This is a new growth engine industry for North Korea to get dollar revenue to bypass sanctions regime, but it was directly impacted back in 2017 and 18. There were no raw material imports, but in 2020, there were no raw material imports at all, but export was done until August, but afterwards it stopped. So again, processing trades of North Korea came to a virtual halt due to COVID-19. By geography as well, 2018-19, even despite the fact that there was a sanction, there were trade diversification policies implemented by North Korea, but it seems that they're going back to where they were. So we're seeing increasing trade volume with Liaoning province. For industry applications, those intermediate goods that are used for industries, there was a drop in import of intermediate goods, and for final goods, import is increasing. So through trade, we see that there are signals of slowing down of industry productions. Due to border closures, currently there's a highest level of COVID-19 quarantine levels there. So the lockdowns began at different points in time for different areas, but they strengthened the border control starting from October. We see a second and third wave in Europe, and North Korea is likely to maintain its border closure until the first quarter next year. The problem is, if such trade activities come to a halt, then what happens to plastics, rubbers, electronic goods, or steel iron products, or transport tools? They don't have any capacity to produce them themselves. How would they be able to meet the demands? Even if there's some inventories left, will they be able to carry that forward until next year? Will it be enough to meet their demands? So we expect that there will be compounded negative effects on the economy. They may be able to muddle through this year, but by the first quarter of next year, economic pressure is only going to grow further. But the North Korean authorities seems to believe that they're able to manage the situation because there are no people dying of hunger. And North Korea even rejected getting any assistance from international organizations. It's telling international aid organizations to leave the country. They're only strengthening their border closures. So they have a very strong mentality towards keeping their borders safe due to the fears of COVID-19. But on the other hand, they believe that their economic conditions are still manageable in their view. More specifically, the situations here, the trade with China, it's very bleak, but there's still domestic demand, quite strong there. And we will have to see the results coming that will come through from January Labor Party convention. And that will require further analysis. Thank you very much. Thank you. Dr. Choi, you mostly dealt with the trade situations of North Korea. This is quite different from their domestic demand. The trade situation is not very positive, but then you have to combine that with the domestic demand.
최지영 박사님 말씀.
Lastly, we'd like to hear from Choi Ji-young from KINU. Hello, my name is Choi Ji-young of KINU. Earlier on, the other speakers talked about the overview of the DPRK economy, different industry sectors, agriculture, and so they've evaluated the policy. And we also heard about trade. And today I'm going to talk about inflation and the exchange rate. As you know, the data on DPRK is very minimal. So I'm just going to try to tell you a little bit about the general statistical trends. As you well know, DPRK economy saw a huge shock after 2017. From 2017 to 2019, the impact to its DPRK economy came primarily from sanctions. And the other fellows have already talked about the sanctions. To some extent, DPRK would have anticipated the coming of the sanctions, but this is very a shock, similar to what it saw in the 1990s. However, until the end of 2019, they were able to get by to some extent, and they were trying to absorb the economic shocks. But then, this year, coupled with the sanctions regime, the COVID-19 situation exacerbated the situation on the DPRK, and this was not expected. So if we compare the sanctions regime with COVID-19, the sanctions were exports control, with COVID, it's now an import control. So the DPRK economy is in a shutdown situation right now because of these different external shocks. There is a shock situation in DPRK market, and there is some skewed movements that we're seeing with the with inflation, with the exchange rate. There has been a lot of volatility in inflation and exchange rate, especially with the exchange rate, because inflation levels stabilized somewhat in May, but then exchange rates saw a huge devaluation, about 1,000 won of undervaluation, depreciation in the value compared to US dollars at the second half of this year, which is not something that can be completely explained away by market forces. And so it appears that there's a very strong intervention at the regime level because of sanctions and because of COVID-19.
데이터를 중심으로 말씀을 드리면 시장의
So if we were to take a look at the data, this is the gasoline prices and rice prices. I looked at the monthly data, but also looked at that on a year-on-year basis. So if you look at the market rice prices, from the first half of 2017 and the first half of 2018, and the second half of 2017 and the second half of 2018, the prices have started to go up and then they went down. But in the first half of this year, rice prices really increased. They skyrocketed around February. This is likely because of COVID-19. China and DPRK trade came to a full stop, and this has led to this volatility in the rice prices. And the rice prices seem to stabilize a little bit, but then again it skyrocketed around April. And after that, as you can see, it stabilized a little bit somewhat. For the gasoline prices, you can see that the prices have been skyrocketing around the time the sanctions were in full force. If you compare rice and gasoline, rice prices skyrocketed even more because of COVID-19 and sanctions. For gasoline, sanctions did have a role, although COVID-19 did not have as much of a role as sanctions, because gas demand is primarily high where there's a lot of demand for export, demand for transport and economic activity. But because of COVID-19, there's just sluggish demand for any kind of economic activity. And also there is some opinion that for gas, at least there's going to be illicit trade of gas. So the volatility of gas prices has not been as high as rice. And the reason for this is because of a psychological anxiety. Because of after COVID-19, we've seen a lot of panic buying in many countries, not just in the DPRK. The DPRK market itself inherently is very unstable, and so that is why we see this peak in rice prices. However, after May, there's been some stabilization in the prices because for rice, the rice that is harvested in the year before is typically released in the market a year later, but last year's harvest was quite good, and so the supply was quite good coming into this year, which is why there was a stabilization in the prices after May and after June. And in April, there was a little bit of supply and demand distortion because of panic buying. And there's also a delay in the effects of the shutdown of the trade between China and the DPRK. However, we're only seeing a little bit of the data for rice and corn and pork and gas. We're only seeing a little bit of these data. So I think there's a lot of different other pieces of data sets that we are not able to have visibility on, and perhaps they have also skyrocketed and they have been very volatile, but we have not been able to see. However, the problem here is the exchange rate. The exchange rate has been continuing to be very volatile compared to the inflation rate. What you see here is compared against the dollar and compared against the yuan. We've seen stable exchange rates compared against the dollar, even in the sanctions regime, but we've seen volatility after COVID-19. There's two different types of data sets. One is from Daily NK, and the other is from Asia Press. They're both media outlets. The yuan-dollar exchange rate, these two media outlets have a little bit of a different reporting structure. So Daily NK said that after the end of April, it was so it was depreciated, but Asia said that there was an actual appreciation of the value in the first half of this year. So there's a little bit of a difference in the interpretation of the two media outlets. So it's difficult to tell which was correct. If we go with the Asia press data, perhaps because of COVID-19, there was widespread psychological anxiety. There may be many people trying to beef up their reserves, foreign reserves, but this does not really explain the depreciation after April. So maybe the government tried to have purchases of their debt in foreign currency, or from April to June, they tried to have a resumption of trade in June, and maybe the import sales were done by foreign currency. Maybe this has been an effort by the state's regime to try to have more foreign reserves, but this still does not explain the appreciation. However, in October, both the two press, Daily NK and Asia Press, has stated that there has been an appreciation of the value by about 1,000 won. So perhaps this is showing the different intervention efforts made by the regime to try to fluctuate, to try to dampen the fluctuations of the exchange rate fluctuations. In the first half of this year, the yuan was very weak, so that had an impact on the North Korean won, and so this meant there was a depreciation in value, and this also went in tandem with the dollar won value, which is why this led to a drop in value in April. However, this still does not explain this huge gap in a value by about 1,000 won. So this is a very high level of volatility, which cannot be explained by anything else other than the regime's intervention. And so this appears to be a change in the policies by the regime, which is, again, as I mentioned, to try to put a control on stopping the sale and purchase of foreign currency. But usually when that happens, the exchange rate should go up, but instead the exchange rate went down, which is not what we're used to seeing. So it appears that maybe the regime has set an arbitrary price, a sort of artificial price, so that the prices cannot go above a certain threshold. Now, this is a sort of price control for exchange rate that they may have put into place. These different policies are something that we only come to learn about later on, and this is released by the media, so this is not something that we're able to officially confirm. And also because China DPRK trade has really come to a stop because of this shutdown situation in place. The state regime is artificially keeping the exchange rate low and having this appreciation in value to try to keep inflation labels stable. In 2019, the regime published a certain different reports on the foreign currency debt, and it appears that they're trying to have some sort of a price controls to stabilize exchange rate to some degree, because they also have an official exchange rate and a market exchange rate and a separate exchange rate called a 협동 or collaborative exchange rate, which sorts of absorbs some part of the market exchange rate. And so it appears that the state is trying to manage the exchange rate to a certain degree, but we still don't know exactly how long they're able to continue on with this appreciation of value. If they really did artificially appreciate the value in April, that was quickly brought back. And then in October, this happened again and inflation stabilized. But right now, they're both going up at the same time. So if anyone who has access to foreign reserves would not want to sell this for cheap in the market, and they might all try to wait for the market levels to stabilize. This means that the regime is trying to appreciate the value in an artificial way, but this is not being well received by the market. However, this is something that we have to continue to see play out in the future. Because we don't have much time, I was talking very quickly. But again, the point here is that inflation and exchange rate have been very volatile. While the inflation has stabilized somewhat, the exchange rate continues to remain very volatile because, to a large extent, the regime has tried to intervene in terms of different policy measures. And this is to try to keep inflation levels steady before the 8th Workers' Party Congress. And this appears to be their goal leading up to that. And market intervention has been something that we've been seeing a lot of after these sanctions have been put in place. And this graph that you see here is the U.S. dollar-priced rice in DPRK market and in the international market. Left is before sanctions, right is after post-sanctions. The international rice prices and the dollar-yuan exchange rate are obviously going similar to they're similar to market levels, but after the sanctions, we see that some of these movements have been disconnected from international market levels. This shows us that the PBS system or the sanctions or the regime has put in artificial price controls here. With the appreciation in value that we've seen recently, it's because the dollar-yuan rate is about 8 times. It's about 6.5 yuan right now. So we see a huge disconnect between DPRK exchange rate and the international exchange rate, because as mentioned by the other speakers, the DPRK economy is at a shutdown situation, and so the regime is putting in very strong policy intervention, and they have a clear objective in mind. If we take a look at a lot of the different indicators, the DPRK regime is trying to do something. They're trying to put in different attempts, but we don't know how long these policies are going to have an effect and for how long, for a long term. If the agriculture and fertilizer output is pretty good this year, then this will have an impact in rice, and perhaps, at least for rice prices, they will be stabilized next year as well. But for this artificial manipulation of the exchange rate, we don't know how long this is going to last, because they don't even have a lot of foreign reserves to begin with, and the sanctions regime has been in place for a very long time. It doesn't appear that they are going to earn a lot of foreign currency through additional exports, so they cannot continue to purchase foreign currency to try to artificially manipulate their exchange rates. In fact, we've also tried to hear news of the regime to try to purchase foreign currency from civilians, from the residents. And perhaps that's why the residents have fought back, and that's why the regime has tried to put these price controls. But in any case, in the long term, we don't know how long of these policy interventions the regime is going to put into place. But at least for foreign currency, because they don't have a lot of foreign currency to begin with, it appears that their wherewithal is going to be very minimized for now.
된 시간이었습니다만은 이제
That was a limited time given to the presentation, but still you gave us a very comprehensive presentation on the price changes. So we've just heard from 7 presenters, and we were going to have a time for discussion, but I don't think we have any time to have any meaningful discussion. But still, we had notified our audience that we were going to have discussion. So I won't probably be able to ask all the speakers over here, but perhaps we can use some time left to have just a bit of a meaningful discussion. So 7 presenters have so far talked about various discourses that are underway in South Korea regarding the North Korean economy. You've dealt with positive aspects as well as the negative aspects of that interpretation. But in general, there will be difficulties, but there are some positive elements that would keep the North Korean economy intact. But of course, discussion, we need to understand that there are differing views. We may, for example, agree at a high level, but at a micro level, there could be different views and perspectives. Perhaps we can use the next few minutes to get your views on that. So 2 questions that I want to pose. Dr. Lee, Yes, you gave us a comprehensive overview of the situation. And other presenters here, you could respond to the questions, or you may choose not to add any comments. Basically, researchers are looking at the policies and institutions and systems in North Korea. Of course, the statistics from North Korea are quite limited. But especially we want to focus on growth rate because it is not really addressed officially or has not been addressed officially by any of the presenters here, especially given the difficulties over there. Many people predict, especially according to the BOK, in 2017 and 2018, with the economic sanctions in place, there was a minus 3.5% growth, a minus 4.1% growth, and 0.4% growth. So what would be the growth rate for the North Korean economy this year? Minus 5 to minus 10% reverse growth is predicted. But BOK has been collecting information about the North Korean economy for about 30 years. But 7.1%, minus 7.1% was the lowest growth rate that was recorded a few years ago. But it is even going to go beyond 7.1% minus. So for the first time in 30 years, it could probably come with the lowest growth rate in 30 years. So in that regards, I want to get your views on the growth rate, the outlook for the North Korean economy. What is your view on this?
최지영 박사님 말씀을
Second, Dr. Choi Ji-young mentioned this, and not only myself, but other North Korean experts are looking at the exchange rate. Basically, they don't have any dollar reserves, and there has to be devaluation or depreciation, but we're seeing appreciation of the value of the North Korean currency, probably because of different factors at place, or because of the National Intelligence Service, for example, reports information to the National Assembly. But it's basically saying that because there's a lack of reserves over there, that they do prosecutions. And what they do is that they're, for example, go ahead, prosecute these or execute these general ordinary citizens over there who are trying to manipulate the exchange rate. So what is the intent of the North Korean government? Are they going for depreciation or appreciation? So what are the factors that are driving the current movements of the exchange rate? This is an area where that's probably conflicting between the private sector and the public sector. So is it going as planned by the North Korean regime, or is it going in a different direction? Of course, there's always that issue in terms of lack of statistics, but this is nonetheless a very critical issue that we must deal with. And the stability issue, not only the economic growth. The fact that the North Korean economy was able to maintain 7 long years of a stable economy with the exchange rate, Dr. Che said they had an impact in terms of export and import. Now, on the real economic side, we have to see how that repercussions are going to affect that area as well as financial sector. Well, at any rate, looking at the time, it's 4 o'clock. Let's try to finish everything in 10 minutes. Dr. Lee, would you like to take the floor to respond to those questions?
네, 굉장히 어려운 질문이고.
Yes, that's a very challenging question. And I think we would have to wait until next year. I think that the BOK will probably come up with announcements of those statistics next June about the growth rates of the DPRK. I think we've also gone through discussions, and I'm going to talk about that later on, but the DPRK economy right now, I think they are really in the worst situation that they've ever had in their history. If we compare this with the arduous march in the 1990s, I think even right now the situation is even worse for the DPRK. Because at least for the UN sanctions, that's something that they had anticipated, so they were prepared for that to some degree, but they were not prepared for COVID-19. So in terms of trade, The sanctions has led to a decrease in exports, but at least for imports, they've managed to contain them at about 7 to 9%. But after COVID-19, even imports have decreased. And so, as we've mentioned with the trade sector, we've seen this imports decrease, which has overall had a very detrimental effect on industrial activity in the DPRK. In trying to respond to this and looking at the policy responses of the DPRK, the conclusion that we have been able to reach is that they are definitely going to see negative growth, but it would be within -5 or -5%, somewhere around that territory. That's what we are thinking right now. And what is going to be very challenging is that this sanctions plus COVID-19 situation, we don't know how long this is going to last. Of course, obviously, this is going to be a problem for the global economy, but we don't know when the vaccines are going to be made, whether they're going to be supplied to the DPRK soon, and that's going to really determine the fate of the DPRK economy. But what I think is going to be very important is that for the metal and chemical industry, how in 2015, they amended their Central Bank Act, and they said that they can adjust the key interest rate along with the key exchange rate. And so, because they can manipulate the policy rate, interest rate, and the policy exchange rate, this is what the regime has been using to try to manipulate these different exchange rates to try to stabilize the market. And that is their ultimate objective, to try to stabilize the market, especially because they don't want the inflation levels to be very volatile. And that is the idea behind their policy intervention. But what is a little bit worrisome is that the results of this intervention, as I mentioned before, right now it's $1 to 80 yuan or so. This is a little bit of a very big gap between the DPRK exchange rates with the market exchange rate. So it doesn't appear that this is going to be sustainable.
예, 감사합니다. 자, 이렇게
Thank you. So that brings us to the end of a discussion. We just heard from our 7 speakers, their presentation and also discussion. Thank you very much. Why don't we give a big round of applause to our presenters here and the audience for staying with us for 2 hours. Thank you very much.